Pennsylvania, was most likely headed for the Capitol or White House. America will never be the same after September 11th, 2001.
There was another one. We just saw another one. Another plane just flew into the second tower. This raises...
Alan Zabrowski, PhD, University of Michigan, is a 10-year U.S. Marine Corps veteran and a graduate of the U.S. Army War College. Now, not only that, and Dr. Zabrowski, correct me if I'm wrong here, not only are you a graduate of the U.S. Army War College, but you were director of studies there for some period of time. Is that correct?
That's correct, for 5.5 years.
5.5 years as director of studies at the U.S. Army War College. You know, of all the things that I would love to be able to have trailing behind my name, Dr. Zabrowski, being the director of studies at the U.S. Army War College would definitely be one of them.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. The only real winner from 9/11 and the wars that it spawned, Afghanistan and Iraq, and of course Iran coming up to the front burner and Syria still simmering on the back burner, is Israel. The only real winner is Israel. No one else benefits. No other country benefits. That doesn't mean that people in the country don't benefit, but no other country does. What we need to stand up and say is they did 9/11. They did it. I have had long conversations over the past 2 weeks with contacts at the Army War College, at its headquarters Marine Corps, and I've made it absolutely clear in both cases that it is 100% certain that 9/11 was a Mossad operation, period.
Right.
9/11 has led directly to 60,000 Americans dead and wounded. A second way of looking at it, and I'm just going to be mentioning a few of the things that have sort of led me to this. A second thing is to look at the requirements for the conduct of this type of an operation. I mean, even taking the U.S. government's case, neither Al-Qaeda nor any other terrorist operation in the world has the discipline, the skills, the coordination, anything else you wish, even to pull off a simultaneous four-plane hijacking, much less do what they did.
Well,
Third, there's WTC-7, the collapse of the third tower. Not hit by a plane, clear controlled demolition, and whatever one might think of the people that were supposedly in the plane. And let's buy the USG case for a moment. Let's say they were all there. You know, that this was a four-plane hijacking, and they decided to do it. There is no way in the world they could have had access to a single WTC building, much less three of them, to wire them for demolitions and bring them down. To wire a massive building for a controlled demolition, much less carry off a four-plane hijacking.
Well,
Totally different capabilities. 90 to 96% of the mainstream media in the United States are either Jewish or Zionist owned.
That's right.
The fact that there was a clamp on discussions about 9/11, on suppression of WTC-7, whose collapse is virtually unknown in America, makes it very clear to me that the people who run it either knew, suspected, or feared that the evidentiary trail an investigation would reveal would lead straight back to Israel. going into an congressional election year. And most members of Congress are extremely vulnerable. They're vulnerable when they go back to their home districts because the local media also is large, like the military and service journals. Local media also is largely not bought or censored by the Zionists. Congress in Washington, the mainstream media, this is the enemy's battleground. That's where that's their strength. That's where they have their resources, their visibility, their access, and their numbers, and where the members of Congress are also largely immune from their own constituencies at home. They have their own interests, and their interests are the local constituency. And these are the people that need to be hit. These are the people that need to be activated, and that's why, according to that principle we were talking about earlier, these are the ones who need to be the recipients of the message.
Almost over, guys. We're switch.
Many Americans and citizens worldwide remained convinced that the truth was being withheld from the public. Why? Why was a growing percentage of the world population becoming increasingly skeptical of the events of September 11th? Was it a natural inclination towards believing the worst about the United States government? Or was it a legitimate concern that only grew more powerful with time? The 9/11 Truth Movement includes academics, engineers, physicists, firefighters, intelligence officials, and some of the very people whose lives have been shattered since September 11th. Were they all delirious?
You should not be here.
No, you've got it all wrong.
We're honoring the fallen heroes from 9/11.
That's all right.
No, you're not. No, you are not.
I feel so uncomfortable.
I'm sorry.
That next year, I'm not coming here.
Or were they a concerned group of individuals taking the necessary steps to prevent the United States from slipping into its darkest era yet? Was September 11th a surprise attack on America by 19 Islamic terrorists? Or something else entirely?
George Bush has spent an uncomfortable day with his people trying to explain away why he failed to pass on warnings the White House had received before September the 11th that terrorists were planning to hijack American aircraft. What happened that day has cast a shadow over just about every area of American life. Now one of the country's best-known journalists has said that the American response to the so-called war on terrorism has created a climate of effective censorship in a land claiming to be the home of free speech.
There's never been an American war, small or large, in which access has been so limited as this one. The belief runs so strong in both the political and military leadership that those who control the images will control public opinion.
Does it suggest that there was somebody on the inside? He kind of compared it to the Godfather story, you know, where the gun was placed in the men's room.
There is also a possibility this could be some kind of inside job.
May it have been an inside job? Might these people have gotten help from the inside?
I was speculating about that along with others early this morning, but now there's a lot more evidence that suggests it's almost certainly the case.
It's an obscene comparison. I'm not sure I like it, but you know, there was a time in South Africa that people would put flaming tires around people's necks if they dissented. The fear is that you'll be here. You'll have a flaming tire of lack of patriotism put around your neck. Now, it's that fear that keeps journalists from asking the toughest of the tough questions and to continue to bore in on the tough questions so often.
People ought to stay out of our business.
A country that hides something is a country that is afraid of getting caught.
And in particular, this Bush administration who is as tight with Saudi Arabia as you can get. The president's father used to stay with the bin Laden family when he would go to Saudi Arabia.
In the past, though, the FBI has sometimes made problems worse by ignoring or denying them.
FBI management intentionally and repeatedly thwarted and obstructed my attempts to launch a more comprehensive investigation to identify and to neutralize terrorists. To the families and victims of September 11th, on behalf of John Benson, Barry Carmby, and myself, we're sorry.
And, I want to say quietly, but as forcefully as I can, that I hope this doesn't go any further. It's gone too far already. I am appalled by it.
On September 13th, the United States government declares that it has overwhelming evidence that bin Laden is responsible for the attacks. The Taliban offers to hand over Osama bin Laden if the United States can provide evidence.
Our position in this regard is that if America have evidence and proofs, they should produce it, and we are ready for the trial of Osama bin Laden in the light of evidence.
Are you willing to hand Osama bin Laden to the United States or not?
No. Without evidence, no.
September 23rd, 2001.
States. The Secretary of State said the administration would soon be able to document its case in public against the Al-Qaeda network and Osama bin Laden.
I think it'll be persuasive.
By the next day, the White House was already backpedaling.
But is there any plan to present public evidence so that, the average citizen, not just Americans, but people all over the world, can understand the case against
Well, I think as Secretary Powell said, there's hope to do that and to do so in a timely fashion over some course of time. But I think the American people also understand that there are going to be times when that information cannot immediately be forthcoming, and the American people seem to be accepting of that.
It seems as though you're asking everyone to trust you.
This information has yet to be provided to the public. Instead of taking credit, bin Laden denies involvement in the attacks 3 times. December 13th, the Department of Defense releases a videotape allegedly discovered in a house in Jalalabad, Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden describes the attacks along with Khaled al-Harbi. American mainstream and even President Bush would portray this videotape as absolute proof of his guilt. International establishments question the authenticity of the tape. December 26th, 2001. A Taliban official claims that he has attended the funeral of Osama bin Laden. The next day, a video believed to be recorded on November 19th is broadcast, in which bin Laden praises the attack, but takes no responsibility. The next bin Laden video would not appear until October 29th, 2004, days before the presidential election. The video is described as the clearest claim of responsibility for 9/11. And when questioned why bin Laden's most wanted poster does not indict him for 9/11, the chief of investigative publicity for the FBI, Rex Toome, replied,
9/11 is not mentioned on bin Laden's most wanted poster is because the FBI has no hard evidence connecting Osama bin Laden to 9/11. Clearly, I couldn't really believe what I had just heard, so I repeated it. And he said, yes, that is correct. The FBI has no hard evidence connecting Osama bin Laden to 9/11.
What evidence do they have? 2 bags belonging to Mohammed Atta checked in at Portland Airport but failed to make Flight 11 at Boston, containing a 757 video tour and flight manual, an Arab-English dictionary, a handheld flight computer, a Quran, and his will. Why would Atta take his will onto a plane that would be destroyed in a fiery inferno? Marwan al-Shehi's rental car, discovered at Logan Airport, containing an Arabic flight manual, an airport restricted area pass, and documents from Huffman Aviation. Nawaf al-Hazmi's rental car, discovered at Dulles Airport, containing Muhammad Atta's instructions, a check for a flight school in Phoenix, 4 drawings of a 757 cockpit, a knife, and maps of Washington and New York. Satam al-Sakami's passport, discovered below the Twin Towers.
Well, Dan, not far from here, a passerby found the passport of one of the hijackers.
How does a passport fly out of a man's pocket through a 400-mile-per-hour airplane crash, survive 9,000 gallons of jet fuel, and land intact on a sidewalk 1,000 feet below? Mahed Maked and Nawaf al-Hazmi's ID cards discovered in the wreckage at the Pentagon. An ID, Saeed al-Ghamdi's passport, Ahmed al-Nami's driver's license, passport photos, and a business card found in Shanksville. The list goes on. A former high-level intelligence official commented to New Yorker magazine, "Whatever trail was left deliberately for the FBI to chase."
They used hundreds of different payphones and cell phones, often with prepaid calling cards that are extremely difficult to trace. And they made sure that all the money sent to them to fund their attacks was wired in small amounts to avoid detection.
Small amounts? Lieutenant General Mahmoud Ahmed, the director of the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, the ISI, was reported to have wired $100,000 to Muhammad Atta in August 2001. This transfer was facilitated by Saeed Sheikh, the man who allegedly kidnapped and murdered Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl, who is investigating the ties between the ISI and Islamic militants.
And the Pakistanis, of course, if you know your history, have only been a couple of degrees of separation away from the so-called Al-Qaeda hijackers.
The ISI has had a long-standing relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency, dating back to the 1980s with the establishment of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which would evolve into Al-Qaeda.
I focus in on the wire transfer that General Mahmoud Ahmed wired to Muhammad Atta right before 9/11. That's pretty crucial because General Mahmoud Ahmed was actually meeting with key Washington, D.C. insiders, Senator Bob Graham, Porter Goss, the future director of CIA, on the morning of 9/11. And he has a relationship not only with the CIA, but with Dick Armitage at State Department, Mark Grossman at State Department.
Yes. Are you aware of the reports at the time that ISI chief was in Washington on September 11 and on September 10th, $100,000 was wired from Pakistan to these groups here in this area? And why he was here? Was meeting with you or anybody in the administration?
I have not seen that report, and he was certainly not meeting with me. Yes?
In the White House transcript of this exchange, which is delivered to the press, the information about the ISI is censored. Bob Graham and Porter Goss will later co-head a joint inquiry which publicly claims that the Bush administration received absolutely no intelligence that could have prevented the attacks. The meeting begins at 8 a.m. over breakfast at the Capitol building and lasts through Flight 175's impact with the South Tower. During his visit, which began on September 4th, Ahmed would also meet with the present director, George Tenet. A month later, after reports of the transfer between himself and Atta, Mahmoud Ahmed retires from the ISI. The 9/11 Commission report will later conclude that they saw no evidence that any foreign government or foreign government official supplied any funding. The Commission decided not only to omit the information, but to deny it entirely.
On page 172 of your report, the 911 report, you state, quote, "The U.S. government has not been able to determine the origin of the money used in the 911 attacks. Ultimately, the question is of little practical significance," end quote. How can you state that the question of who bankrolled the deaths of 3,000 American people on September 11th is, quote, of little practical significance?
Because it costs so little money. That's the awful thing about it. It costs less than $500,000. That's why it was so hard to trace. We were able to find pieces of the $500,000, but it came in very small pieces.
And you said earlier $500,000 to do the 9/11 operation. Well, we know
that $100,000 was wired to Muhammad Atta directly from the head of Pakistani ISI.
Well, I'm not aware of $100,000 in Muhammad Atta, but the Pakistan, I think, is the most dangerous country in the world.
Why was there such a vested interest in covering the transaction between the ISI and Muhammad Atta?
And let's talk about that wire transfer, because Governor Kaine had no basis for denial, because the FBI and the Wall Street Journal confirmed the General Mahmoud Ahmed wire transfer I'm talking about. But the 9/11 Commission deliberately said that funding is not important and assigning blame is not important to them, but it is to us.
As if their funding was not suspicious enough, a number of hijackers reportedly trained at U.S. military bases.
As hard as this is to believe that 2 of the alleged terrorists involved in what happened on Tuesday may have attended schools run by the U.S. military. Now, this is according to a senior defense official.
Ahmed al-Nami, Ahmed al-Ghamdi, and Saeed al-Ghamdi listed their address on both driver's licenses and car registrations as the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida. Muhammad Atta reportedly graduated from the U.S. International Office School at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. In response to a Freedom of Information Act, Captain Jason Taylor confirmed that a Muhammad Atta trained there between 1998 and 1999, but did not verify if it was the same person. Abdulaziz Al-Amari attended Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. Saeed al-Ghamdi and others attended the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, as confirmed by Lieutenant Colonel Steve Butler, Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs. American media ceases investigation when the Air Force says, "We are probably not talking about the same people." 2 of the hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Madar, rented an apartment from and lived with an FBI informant. Curiously, a number of them were reported to still be alive after the attack. Finally, we were led to believe that the alleged hijackers were fundamentalist Muslims spending their final days preparing for paradise. Yet, in the week before the attacks, a number of them would drink, visit strip clubs, and solicit prostitutes.
By all accounts, Atta and his cousin kept to themselves, except for last Thursday at this bar in Hollywood, Florida. It's believed both men came in, drank heavily, and then refused to pay the bill.
And the guy got like very, very offended, and he said to me, he said, "Oh, I can pay my bill. I'm an airline pilot." And I was like, okay.
Mahed Maked is spotted several times at a porn shop. Hamza al-Ghamdi ordered a porno in his hotel on September 10th. The mayor of Paterson, New Jersey, states that they are spotted more at go clubs than at mosques. Regardless of their actions, some of the hijackers' presence was known as early as 2000.
What did we know? When did we know it? That's what some congressmen are asking now, and asking quite loudly. Did we know the year before 9/11 that one of the hijackers was a terrorist threat?
Army Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer has gone public with his charge that Able Danger, a military intelligence project he worked with in 2000, identified Muhammad Atta, even pulled up his picture along with 3 other 9/11 hijackers as possible al-Qaeda members.
We found the identities of 4 of the 9/11 hijackers prior to 9/11.
But he says beginning in September 2000, 3 meetings he set up with the FBI were each canceled by military lawyers. Schaefer also says he remembers telling then 9/11 Commission staff at a meeting in Afghanistan about Atta and what the intelligence unit found back in 2000. And he was surprised that it did not show up in the Commission's report.
I'm told confidently by the person who did move the material over that the 9/11 Commission received 2 briefcase-size containers of documents. I can tell you for a fact that would not be 1/20th of the information that Able Danger consisted of during the time we spent.
A 9/11 Commission spokesman said nothing they got from the Pentagon in early 2004 backed up Schaefer's claim, quote, "None of the documents turned over to the Commission mentioned Muhammad Atta or any of the other future hijackers."
Where is it? Where's the beef? Where's the substance? Where is this mysterious chart that purportedly says that Atta was connected in some real way to these other hijackers? We'd love to see it.
The company responsible for the chart Orion Scientific Systems would claim that only 2 charts were produced and that Atta was not present on either one.
Throw them all out, John. These are all the charts. Spread them out. These are all Orion-produced charts. These charts were all done by the data mining efforts. So the Orion Corporation lied to the Senate Judiciary Committee staff. All data mining efforts, and yet the company said to the Senate Judiciary staff, we don't have any of those charts. They're not ours. Well, here they are. And their logos are on each one of them.
Well, Mr. Chairman, at least 2 of the 5 people that were going to appear today were threatened with removal of their security clearances if they continue to talk about this. This is going
Are you
back.
at liberty to identify who those 2 are?
I will to you. I'd rather do it privately since the Defense Department has chosen not to allow anyone to testify, but I will provide that information to the committee.
For the life of me, I don't understand why, as I understand it, I stand corrected if I'm wrong, but I understand the witnesses we assumed we were going to get to hear from the Defense Department have been pulled. They may be or may not be in the room, but have been instructed that they cannot testify. I think that's a big mistake.
This is actually a chart of Al-Qaeda and the various cells around the world. Much of this data, most of it was obtained prior to 9/11 by the work of Able Danger. As you see, there is an actual photograph of Muhammad Atta.
What does that depict generally?
It depicts the organizational and activity associations of Al-Qaeda operatives that were involved in 9/11 and related events.
And at the time, if the Commission had looked into this in early 2004, the charts that had Muhammad Atta on it still existed. There was a chart in Mr. Smith's office. There was the chart that still should have been in the Defense Intelligence Agency because it wasn't destroyed within Lieutenant Colonel Schaefer's files until the spring of 2004. The same with the chart that Mr. Smith had.
Our support to Able Danger became severely restricted and ultimately shut down due to intelligence oversight concerns. I was supported vigorously by both the LEWA and the INSCOM chain of commands, and we actively worked to overcome this shutdown for the next several months. In the midst of this shutdown, I, along with one of my analysts, Chief Warrant Officer 3 Terry Stevens, were forced to destroy all data, charts, and other analytical products that we had not already passed on to SOCOM related to Able Danger.
Another former DOD official will testify today that he was ordered to destroy up to 2.5 terabytes of data. Now, I don't know what a terabyte of data is, so we contacted the Library of Congress. It's equal to 1/4 of all the entire written collection that the Library of Congress maintains.
Are you in a position to evaluate the credibility of Captain Philpott, Colonel Schaefer, Mr. Westphal, Ms. Preissler, Mr. J.D. Smith as to their credibility when they say they saw Muhammad Atta on a chart?
Yes, sir. I believe them implicitly.
Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer, who was the first member of Able Danger to go public, has now been told in writing by the Defense Intelligence Agency that he can't speak to members of Congress or their staff without prior approval. And now a security clearance, which allowed him to deal with classified information, has been pulled. The congressman says Schaefer has been gagged, punished for speaking up.
The official response to Able Danger began in September 2005 with a letter from 9/11 Commissioner Slade Gordon to Senator Arlen Specter. Gordon concludes by saying that since Condoleezza Rice, President Bush, and the White House denied that Able Danger identified the 9/11 hijackers, it never happened. A 6-month investigation by the Senate Intelligence Committee concluded in December 2006 that Able Danger did not identify Muhammad Atta or any other 9/11 hijacker. Can we be certain that the hijackers were radical Muslims on a suicide mission? Or is there a possibility that they were trained, funded, and protected in our own country?
Rach Deskins?
Yes, ma'am, Sergeant Rorta.
Yes.
I'm just letting you know for information we're having an exercise, SF exercise. We're having a comm out.
Okay.
Guys.
Happy, thanks.
All right, thank you. Back.
Between September 2000 and June 2001, the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, would scramble fighter jets to intercept errant aircraft 67 times. Interceptions are routine and usually occur within 10 minutes of a sign of trouble, such as permanently losing radio contact and transponder signal or flying off course. On the morning of September 11th, according to official accounts, 4 commercial airliners would be off course and out of communication, and not one of them would be intercepted.
How is it that on 4
separate occasions on one day that $1 trillion military and intelligence infrastructure could fail.
Never did in anybody's thought process about how to protect America did we ever think that the evildoers would fly not one, but 4 commercial aircraft into precious U.S. targets.
I don't think anybody could have predicted that these people would take an airplane and slam it into the World Trade Center, take another one and slam it into the Pentagon.
Nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government that could envision flying airplanes into buildings on such a massive scale.
But that turns out not to be true. U.S. military planners did envision and practice those very scenarios. As reported by USA Today, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, conducted exercises with fighter jets, simulating hijacked planes flown into the World Trade Center in the 2 years before the attacks. Pentagon planners also envisioned the attack on the Pentagon 5 months before it happened. According to this April 2001 Pentagon email, Air Force officials wanted a war game, having a terrorist group hijack a commercial airline and fly it into the Pentagon. The idea was to check response times to launch fighter jets. But according to the Pentagon email, the plan was ultimately rejected by senior Pentagon officials as too unrealistic. Still to come are questions, big questions, about NORAD's response on the day of the attack. Why, despite all the exercises and the planning, Peter, jet fighters were not in place anywhere near New York or Washington.
Quite an amazing story. Many thanks, Brian. Brian Ross.
One drill, called Amalgam Virgo, was conducted on June 1st and 2nd, 2001, and simulated successful terrorist attacks. Its purpose was to focus on unconventional threats, including an airborne hijacking. One plan would simulate the hijacking of a commercial airliner, which would be crashed into the Capitol. The second part of the exercise, which was planned but not executed before 9/11, involved 2 planes with actual pilots on the flight deck. FBI agents would hijack the planes and divert them to secure locations. And on its cover, Osama bin Laden. In fact, multiple war games were underway on 9/11 itself.
The question was, we had 4 war games going on September 11th, and the question that I tried to pose before the secretary had to go to lunch was whether or not the activities of the 4 war games going on September 11th actually impaired our ability to respond to the attacks.
The answer to the question is no, did not impair our response. In fact, General Eberhart, who was then the commander of North American Aerospace Defense Command, as he testified in front of the 9/11 Commission, I believe he told them that it enhanced our ability to respond. There were 2 CPXs. There was 1 Department of Justice exercise that didn't have anything to do with the other 3, and there was an actual operation ongoing because there was some Russian bomber activity up near Alaska.
So, did the war games ultimately help or hinder our response? September 11th was day 2 of Vigilant Guardian, an exercise staged by the Joint Chiefs and NORAD, which simulated hijacked planes in the northeastern United States. Vigilant Guardian is a branch of Global Guardian, a mass Armageddon exercise being conducted at Offutt Air Force Base in cooperation with NORAD. Originally scheduled to take place in late October, Global Guardian was moved to September. The exercise is reportedly canceled after the second Twin Tower is hit. 3 E-4B Doomsday planes remain airborne.
2 government sources familiar with the incident tell CNN it was a military aircraft, but say the details are classified. This comparison of the CNN video and an official Air Force photo suggests the mystery plane is among the military's most sensitive aircraft, an Air Force E-4B. The E-4B is a state-of-the-art flying command post, built and equipped for one reason: to keep the government running no matter what, even in the event of a nuclear war. Ask the Pentagon, and it insists this is not a military aircraft. and there is no mention of it in the official report of the 9/11 Commission. The Pentagon, the Secret Service, and the FAA all say they, at least for public consumption, have no explanation of the giant plane over the president's house, just as the smoke began to rise across the river at the Pentagon.
Barksdale Air Force Base also participated in Global Guardian. Instead of returning directly to Washington, D.C., President Bush would fly to both Barksdale and Offutt Air Force Base before returning to the White House. Another drill, Northern Vigilance, moved fighter jets to Canada and Alaska to monitor a fleet of Russian MiGs on a training mission. Northern Vigilance also placed inputs onto military radar screens. Also referred to as phantoms, inputs are simulated errant aircraft, which appear real to those participating in the exercise.
We fought many phantoms that day.
3 F-16s from Andrews Air Force Base, located 15 miles from the Pentagon, are flown 180 nautical miles away for a training mission in North Carolina. Fort Belvoir, an Army base 10 miles south of the Pentagon, intended to test security in case of a terrorist attack. Employees in the Office of Emergency Management on the 23rd floor of World Trade Center Building 7 continue preparations for Tripod, a biological attack drill scheduled for September 12th. Finally, the National Reconnaissance Office in Virginia begins a drill at 8:45, conducted by a team from the CIA, in which a plane crashes into their building. Also, a number of war games were being conducted that have yet to be fully disclosed.
Ask about the war games that were planned with 9/11.
Commissioner Gorelick.
Could you please be quiet? We have only a few minutes with General Myers. I'd like to ask a question. General Myers, I'm sorry.
I would ask, please, people in the audience to be quiet if you want to stay here.
Sir, statement. This commission has not answered my questions. I'm walking out. It's a farce. I will. Thank you.
So let me get this straight. On the morning of 9/11, the United States is running drills in which hijacked aircraft go in and out of radar. Fighter jets are flown out of the United States, and planes are crashed into buildings. What a coincidence.
And in terms of what motivated me to bring the aircraft down, as you see one thing happen, that's an accident. When you see two of the same thing occur, it's a pattern. But when you see three of the same thing occur, it's a program. And so at that point, I decided to bring all the aircraft down.
And so, at 9:45, all airborne planes were forced to land. This order applied to all civilian aircraft. Certain military planes were allowed to remain airborne. By 12:16 that afternoon, the FAA managed to ground over 4,000 planes without incident.
During the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon, there was a young man who would come in and say to the vice president, the plane is 50 miles out, the plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the vice president, do the orders still stand? And the vice president turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?
Arlington, Virginia. American Airlines Flight 77 allegedly crashes into the ground floor of the Pentagon. Pentagon authorities will deny that the building had anti-aircraft defense. The FBI arrives within minutes, and the site is declared a federal crime scene, becoming their exclusive responsibility. With the help of civilians, they comb the Pentagon lawn for debris, and within 24 hours, they had confiscated every known video of the attack. Pentagon officials initially denied that any of their cameras captured the event.
I am Major General Albert Stubblebine. I am retired Army Major General. In my last assignment, my last command, I was responsible for all of the Army's strategic intelligence forces around the world. I had responsibility for the signals intelligence, photo intelligence, counterintelligence, human intelligence. They all belonged to me in my last assignment. I was supposed to find out what the enemy was doing before the enemy did it so that we could take action against the enemy. That's intelligence, okay? Before the fact. So we always rely not on a single piece of data before we make a statement, but on multiple. And the more pieces of data that you have that correlate, the better you know exactly what is going on. So I have had a lot of experience in looking at photographs. I have looked at many, many different kinds of photographs from many, many different platforms on many, many different countries around the world.
Okay, so on September the 11th in 2001, what hit the Pentagon?
I don't know exactly what hit it, but I do know from the photographs that I have analyzed and looked at very, very carefully, it was not an airplane.
What made you believe that?
Well, for one thing, if you look at the hole that was made in the Pentagon, the nose penetrated far enough so that there should have been wing marks on the walls of the Pentagon. I have been unable to find those wing marks. So where were they? Did this vessel, vehicle, or whatever it was, have wings? Apparently not, because if it had had wings, they would have made marks on the side of the Pentagon. One person counteracted my theory and said, oh, well, you've got it all wrong, and the reason that it's wrong is that as the airplane came across, one wing tipped down and hit the ground and broke off. I said, fine, that's possible. One wing could have broken off. But if I understand airplanes correctly, most airplanes have two wings. I haven't met an airplane with only one wing.
Well, folks, welcome to this edition of On Second Thought. What you've been seeing here is a compilation. First, we started with that young whippersnapper, Corey. He and two of his partners produced a really good early expose of how our government covered up the truth about 9/11. It's called Loose Change, second edition. The first edition was kind of amateurish, and it made puns and tried to make fun of 9/11. Nevertheless, it spread across the East Coast where it was produced, and many people said, hey, you need to tweak this and change that, and he did, and he got more footage, and this resulted in Loose Change. But what you haven't been told, unless you watch this show a lot, is that young man was taken into custody by the military and held on an East Coast military base for I forget how long. And the point was, they said, you're not getting out of here until you make a public statement that everything you tried to prove was wrong. And they weren't going to release him. It was a matter of national security or some other kind of gobbledygook government BS. Whenever the government starts saying national security, we can't tell you because the national security would jeopardize, what they really mean is our bosses, the president, the vice president, you know, the Joint Chiefs of Chaffs, yeah, Joint Chiefs of Chaffs, I said that right. They would be up for high treason, hanging. Not just indictment and a slap on the hand, but high treason and hanging. That's what they really mean when they say, oh, we can't disclose that because it's a matter of national security. Our government has gone from a time of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and President Adams, a time of where everything was open. People published the most inconsiderate newspaper articles, both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, just really slamming it to each other. We've gone from that time to a time where they just say national security. We can't talk about that. It's a bunch of malarkey. So here you just saw the late General Stubblebine. He was in Germany. That's why the subtitles were in German. I believe he died in Panama or somewhere down in Latin America because he found it safer, even though he had been a major general in the United States military, it was safer for him in Panama because they didn't want him talking. And the most important thing you got out of that is he said, I can't tell you what hit the Pentagon, but I can tell you it wasn't that airplane they said it was. That's huge. That's why he had to finish up his life in retirement, take his military pension down in Panama. And why he died when he died, I'm not going to get into that. But you look what happened to a Major General Stubblebine who had to leave America so he could retire in some comfort and freedom. Couldn't retire in America after he told the truth. And that's why I played to all that beginning part where he was talking about he was in charge of intelligence and counterintelligence, human intelligence. He was supposed to be able to figure out what the enemy was doing and stop them before they did it. And he was telling you no plane hit the Pentagon, despite all the ABC, CBS, Fox News, CNN, gobbledygook that tell you that same lie every September. And they never talk about the third building in New York City, 7 World Trade Center, otherwise known, or used to be known as the Solomon Building, which just fell down 6 hours after the Twin Towers and no plane hit it at all. They can't tell you these facts because you might start scratching your head and say, could our government be lying to us? You're darn tootin' right they're lying to you. They lied to you about the Kennedy assassination. I got the Warren report. I read it 2, 3, 4 times, and it's like 3 different people wrote different parts of it, and they didn't talk to each other. So one part contradicts another part. It was the same with the 9/11 Commission, except in the 9/11 Commission, there were people who should have been allowed to testify, and they were not. And then they had Dick Cheney and President Bush come together and make a statement together so they could each hear what the other said. That's not how you do an investigation. And they did not do it under oath. Why, everybody else has to do it under oath, but not the vice president, not the president. That was another huge cover-up. The 9/11 Commission report is garbage. The people who should have been included were excluded. That's the shame of that. So how does this relate to today? Here we are in January of 2019. How does that relate to today? Things have gotten worse and worse, I think, until Bush died and he never got indicted. And now Trump took office 2 years ago. And Nancy Pelosi does not want to invite him to make a State of the Union address to a joint session of Congress. Well, I don't think there's any requirement that says he has to physically go in there. By the Constitution, he just has to make a report. He can submit it in writing. He could do it over YouTube. He could do it any way he pleases. We know the Democrats aren't going to listen to him anyway. So what's really going on? What's really going on is President Donald Trump, God bless the man, he is trying to cut back the criminals, the treasonous, rotten people like Comey and Miller and that other guy, what's his name, Erd, who are committing treason. They got a foreign agent to make a fake report claiming Trump had Russian connections that were going to help him control, the Russians control America. What Trump was really probably doing is trying to set up a deal to build more Trump towers in Russia, in Moscow, and Kaliningrad, and Leningrad, and other places. Had nothing to do with controlling America. And he probably will get those deals made once he's out of office, if he lives that long. What I think Trump is really doing is what Ronald Reagan tried to do. And everybody loved Ronald Reagan because he had these one-liners. He'd come back at you with a one-liner and just shut you down. And it was funny, the way Ronnie Reagan delivered it. I mean, he had 30, 40 years of delivering his lines for movies. He was really good at putting across the one-liners. What Trump is trying to do is what Reagan tried to do: cut down the government. Reagan said he was going to get rid of the Federal Tea Tasters Board, which wastes a few $1 million a year, paying people outrageous salaries to do very little except taste a little tea. Why not just let the markets settle that? Trump knows that the bank gangsters have their own agents in the CIA, in the FBI. That's why that fake report, which is now admitted to have been totally bogus, to which Mueller has based this thing on, and then people did what the lawyers usually do: they lie a little bit, skirt the truth a little bit, and he's nailed him on skirting the truth. But the essential thing is that report was written by an ex-British agent, and he knew he was writing it for the DNC, Democratic National Committee, and he knew it was to tell big, whopping lies. He knew that. And why did that young man get killed that used to work at the DNC? Why didn't we ever get more information about that? He's been totally forgotten now. Brushed aside, is forgotten. Just like Martha Mitchell, wife of the Attorney General John Mitchell. She was going to rat something out. She died. Now that's just all brushed aside and forgotten. I want to know the truth about Martha Mitchell. I want to know who that killed that young man. Just don't say it was MS-13 gang members and that's the end of it. Gang members don't care what the DNC does. Somebody hired them to knock somebody off. Just like LBJ and George Herbert Walker Bush, that scumbag of scumbags, Vice President LBJ, I already mentioned, J. Edgar Hoover, all in on the killing of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And I wasn't even a Kennedy fan, but I object to having our presidents murdered with the cooperation of the vice president, the head of the FBI, the head of the CIA, and George Herbert Walker Bush, a.k.a. scumbag number one, who was a low-level CIA agent at that time. And I want to know why one of those agencies, their head director, drowned swimming in shallow water where he'd swam for many, many, many years. I want to know what happened to Vince Foster. How did he shoot himself, then take his own body and dump it miles from where he shot himself through the head? If he did shoot himself through the head, why isn't there a big splatter of blood there? Why didn't they find a gun until after the crooked FBI agents, if they were FBI agents, showed up and said, "Oh, we found the gun"? It reminds me of that big, tall, black cop, Sergeant Yeekey, who allegedly cut his wrist, cut his throat twice, and then got out of his car and crawled over a mile to die in some dry ditch somewhere, and then shot himself in the back of the head. I don't believe any of this nonsense, and you shouldn't either. That's what official government records tell us. I hope you were listening to General Stubblebine. He's dead, but not forgotten. At least not forgotten by this military veteran. William Wagener's not forgotten him. And Mr. Corey, that young whippersnapper who did, him and his two partners put together, and they were here on this show, right here in this studio many years ago, did a brilliant job going and investigating what the FBI couldn't find, the CIA couldn't find, NSA couldn't find, or did they? And they didn't want to tell the truth. Think about that. But these young guys out of San Diego came up there and they found it. It's unfortunate Corey had to recant loose change, but after a while you get tired of being locked up in a prison cell. Just ask any Vietnam veteran who was captured by North Vietnam, whether he was a pilot or not, and they say, you know, we're going to torture you tonight, we're going to torture you tomorrow morning. Now just say these words and we won't torture you. Say even nicer words, how America's an imperialist, warmongering nation, and we might trade you off for some other prisoners. You might get to go home, see your wife and kids. Unless you've ever been in that situation, it's hard. I believe Corey, that young man who did Loose Change Second Edition, he was coerced by your government working for the bank gangsters and the people that promote wars. It's just incredible. Trump is having an argument over 0.1% of the federal budget, $5 billion. Here's what hasn't made sense to me until I thought this through thoroughly. What if he just goes on right up to the election date on 2020 saying government shut down? Well, after a certain number of days, these people are furloughed and they get paid up to, I think, the 30 days. And if they still don't get called back, they're permanently out of a job. Well, that's one way to scale back the fat on the federal government. Now, if Trump were to go and say, I know this guy's a communist agent, and that guy's a banking agent, and this guy's a treasonous agent, and try to single them out, well, their defense attorneys will all jump up and say, oh, I got to sue you, President. We're going to sue, and you're going to have to pay and pay. But if he just finds an issue, and this is what I think Trump has done, because the reason that doesn't make sense is the Pentagon has a $100 billion standby emergency fund for the president, any president. It's been there for years. And it sees there's a real national emergency. He can just grab $5 billion and build that wall. Boom. Problem solved. To Nancy Pelosi and all her liberal pedophile Democrat friends, you know, just two. Just like they were going to take this junket to Europe, and Trump just said, oh, we can't afford to spend the military fuel to fly you in a military plane to Europe. Sorry, government's shut down. We got to conserve money. What's he doing? He's getting rid of a lot of fat, and in a lot of that fat are the treasonous criminals. He doesn't want them to come to an agreement. And this is the only way he can shut down the government, say, we're going to just shut this down. I just wish he'd shut down the IRS completely and say, all IRS employees, you're done. If he just did that one thing, if President Donald Trump just did that one thing and said, we're going to cut off all funding to all IRS agents, the entire bureaucracy is cut off of funding. You get nothing. And just stick with that for 3 or 4 years so they cannot do their job and say to Americans, well, I see there's nobody to take your checks, so I guess you don't have to pay the income tax. I think Trump would be reelected by the greatest landslide America has ever seen. Just get rid of the IRS and then get rid of the Federal Reserve and declare the national debt dead, a nullity. And all you people that are paying loans to Chase and Wells Fargo Bank and Morgan and First Bank or whatever, and went through this securitization process, which is an illegal process, in my view, he just declare all their loans null and void, so you never have to pay on your mortgage again. America would be made great so fast. People would have so much spending money, and then the Treasury just print their own money, only to be debt-free. Debt-free money. That's what I think Trump's doing. He's getting rid of the fat of the federal government, and he's using the wall issue to do it. I salute you, President Donald Trump. Brilliant. Brilliant. And Nancy Pelosi, the senile old witch from San Francisco, who I can't believe even those people in San Francisco are so deluded to have reelected her again and again. But they did, apparently, if you can trust our elections, which we know in California you can't. We know elections are stolen quite regularly. You just got to know how they do it. So with that, you see why understanding what really happened in 9/11, how they covered it up and lied and lied and lied. You can't trust anything you're hearing about Trump or Nancy Pelosi. You can't trust any of it. Do your own research. Anyway, Reggie, it's time to roll that.
Ready?
Yep, roll it.
All right, cool.
This matters. It does matter.
William Wagener here for We the People. For years, I have wondered why local fire chiefs and fire department people, even some that were at the cleanup at the World Trade Center, were afraid to come forward and say, something's very wrong with this non-investigation. Well, finally, a New York City fireman has stepped up to the plate with the backing of hundreds of other firemen who know that the federal government did not do a proper forensic investigation on the World Trade Center collapse, especially 7 World Trade Center, the 3rd building, which no plane hit. Here it is. Finally, Bush and Cheney will have to be held accountable, along with all the other federal people that helped them cover up what really happened on September 11, 2001. Listen carefully.
Thank you very much. And like Richard said, my name is Eric Lawyer, and I founded the Firefighters for 9/11 Truth after I watched Richard in one of his presentations, and I realized that something more had to be done. And I just want to thank Richard for everything he's doing here, and the Firefighters for 9/11 Truth strongly support Richard Gage and all the architects and engineers that have the courage to sign that petition. And I know from personal experience there's about 5 times as many out there that believe what we believe but don't have the courage to sign it. So what I'm hoping today is that people will find the courage after listening to this presentation and seeing everybody here and seeing that we are behind it. We also demand an investigation that follows the national standards and has contempt and subpoena powers. 9/11 was the greatest loss of life and property damage in U.S. fire history. This should have been the most protected, preserved, over-tested, and thorough investigation of a crime scene in world history. Sadly, it was not. What was it? Well, we know from their own admission the majority of the evidence was destroyed. Like Richard said, 22 years of experience. I've seen a lot of crime scenes. I've never seen anything like this in my life. I was out at the site. I saw trucks leaving faster than anywhere I've ever seen, but I accepted it at the time, and for years I accepted it because it was a recovery and rescue operation, and that's normal to have something like that going. Again, we've never seen anything like it, but that was expected. What I didn't know for years, what was going on behind the scenes, was that evidence was being destroyed when it was shipped off. By their own admission, Tower 7 investigation, this investigation at Tower 7 had no physical evidence. How do you investigate a crime when you've destroyed all the evidence? It doesn't make sense. They also admit that they refused to test the explosives, or to test for explosives or residue of thermite. Now, this is what I'm going to go into here just real quickly, is there are national standards for an investigation. That's what all of us are asking for, an investigation that follows national standards and holds people accountable. This manual right here, just so you can see it, is what we call the Fire Investigation 101. This is the most basic fire investigation manual there. This is for the 2001 edition. This is what should have been referred to, at least. It doesn't have to be followed exactly, but it should have been used as a guideline for the investigation. I'm just going to cover a few of the things that are in here. So NIST violated, and the initial investigators that did not protect the scene violated the most basic of the guidelines. And I'm going to cover 5 of them here. One is the NFPA 9.3.6. It covers spoliation of evidence. Specifically what it reads is, once evidence has been removed from the scene, it should be maintained and not destroyed or altered until the investigation is complete. The steel was melted down prior to the investigation. We know that from their own admission. This is no conspiracy theory stuff. 19.2.4, exotic accelerants. If on the scene you find melted steel or concrete, you should consider the use of exotic accelerants. And they specifically say in the manual, thermite mixtures produce exceedingly hot fires that can account for melted steel and concrete. It also says they leave residues that can be tested for visually and chemically identifiable. Again, they did not test for it. And just put it in perspective, on a routine house fire, if we suspect even the slightest use of an accelerant, we're going to test for it when there's no fatalities, when there's very little property damage. So to not do it on this, there is absolutely no excuse. I can't drive that point home enough. 18.15 is analyze fuel source. All available fuel sources should be considered and eliminated until one fuel can be identified as meeting all the physical damage criteria. For example, if you find pulverized concrete, which we all know there was in all 3 buildings, there was pulverized concrete, that only fuels that can create seeded explosions should be considered. So they shouldn't be considering fires. They shouldn't be doing that. It doesn't account for pulverized concrete. They should only be considering exotic accelerants and explosives. 19.4.8.2.6, extremism. The terrorist may include fire as but one of a variety of weapons along with explosives used in furthering his or her goal. We know they used them in '93. Why would we not test for them now? There was reports that day, multiple reports, which I'll get into in a second. So they could have put them in the basement. How do we know that unless we test for it? I mean, even if it is the terrorists that they claim they are, we need to test this. 14.3, preservation of the fire scene and physical evidence. We find the following. The cause of a fire explosion is not known until near the end of the investigation. The entire fire scene should be considered physical evidence and should be protected and preserved. It's just over and over. There's so many. You can go to our website, the Firefighters for 9/11 Truth. We have many more of these actual chapters that cover what they should have done that they did not do. So now, by their own admission, in all 3 building collapses, NIST refused to physically test, like Dr. Stephen Jones did, for explosives. This is just unbelievable. And here are their excuses, and I quote, "It is unlikely that 100 pounds of thermite or more could have been carried into World Trade Center 7 and placed around columns without being detected, either prior to September 11th or during that day." So again, I've been on a lot of fire scenes and I've seen a lot of investigations, and why would we not test because something's hard to do? That's the exact reason you need to investigate it. If that was hard to do, we need to find out how they did it. And number 2, NIST excuse. In addition, no blast sounds were heard on the audio tracks of the video recordings during the collapse of World Trade Center 7 or reported by witnesses. That's one of the excuses why they didn't test. Well, apparently they didn't read Chapter 18. 18 is the general definition of explosions. Although an explosion is almost always accompanied by the production of a loud noise, the noise itself is not, in big bold letters, an essential element in the definition of an explosion. The generation and violent escape of gases are the primary criteria of an explosion. So that alone says they should have tested for it. But then we also, NIST has lied, and we can prove it. As soon as the new investigation happens, the evidence is out there for you to see right now. We have 118 first responders who reported explosions. We have the radio transmissions from FDNY members that are still recorded today that reported explosions. We have audio recordings. We have video recordings. I've personally talked to witnesses that heard them. So there's nothing short of saying they lied, and they need to be held accountable. And besides that, like I said, there is no excuse for not testing for explosives. And so at the very least, at the very best, even if you want to believe the official story, this was the most incompetent investigation of all time. And I've talked to a lot of investigators that were there, and I asked them the specific question, why did they refuse to test? They weren't the ones who refused, but NIST did. And they said, all we can say, all they can answer is incompetence, or they tell me to shut up. They cannot give me any reason that follows national standards. So, but the reality, after all the research everybody here and the incredible people we're in the room with today have done, the reality is it was a criminal investigation to cover up the crime. So, just to finish, I'd like to read a quote. This is from a retired, decorated FDNY lieutenant. Anyone who knows the fire service, he is a stud. He worked on Ladder Company 26, Rescue Company 3, Rescue Company 1 in his career. Anyone who knows, those are amazing companies. Here's his comment. Trade Tower 7 by itself is the smoking gun, not hit by an aircraft with only a few relatively small fires. It came down in a classic crimp and implosion, going straight into its basement, something only very precise demolitions can accomplish, which takes days, if not weeks, to prepare. The 9/11 Commission didn't even mention it, and FEMA actually stated they didn't know why it collapsed and left it at that. Brothers, I know that the above implications are hard, almost unthinkable, but the official explanation is utter nonsense, and 343 of our murdered brothers are crying out for justice. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I have had trouble with somebody going into my pantry and stealing little sweet treats out of there. And lo and behold, I kept thinking, somebody's breaking into our house and stealing stuff. I hide them behind the dishes, and we set this camera up, and it caught our cat, the great Zombino. And there he is, caught, black pawed. See that? Black pawed. We caught him going in there. There was the thief. So get a shot of this. I had a little chat with the big black cat, and I explained to him that he was not supposed to go in there and help himself to treats. And we were nose to nose, and basically he said, I'm going to do what I want to do because I'm a cat and I can. Well, I said, you ought to apply for a federal government job, like president or something. You can just break all the rules you want and nobody can do anything. Anyway, moving on. Coming up February 25th in Hawaii, in Honolulu, the trial of Anthony Williams, who has appeared here on this show in this studio like 3 years ago. In February 20th, I believe it was, he's been held in jail. They're trying to say he's a criminal because he tried to help people stop foreclosures on their house, usually elderly, less educated, poor people being kicked out of their homes by shrewd, sneaky, slimy people known as attorneys and members of the bar, with, Thomas Mesereau, Susan Yu, and my friend in Houston, exceptions to the... But if you understand how the banking scam works, they don't lend you any money. They get you to agree to make payments. They lend a credit, which then is paid forward to the other person, but the credit is backed by you. And you usually have mortgage insurance in case you default. And if you default, they collect on the mortgage insurance so they don't lose anything. So why should you, as a homeowner, lose your home? Anyway, Anthony Williams, whether he made a technical mistake or not, he goes on trial. On second thought, intends to have camera footage and coverage of that trial taking place in Honolulu, because it matters to millions of Americans who are being defrauded by scheming attorneys and scheming bankers. Here's a shot of Anthony back when he was here on the show.
Unless somebody made it happen that way. That's correct. There is no coincidence. There ain't no accidents. Nothing happens in politics unless they want it to happen. Tonight, I have the pleasure, and I rarely do this, we're going to spend the whole show, and I think it's going to be, what did you say, jaw-dropping and bra-popping? We have in Mr. Williams here a man who has taken upon himself to enforce the law when you're a crooked county district attorney like Tony Rackauckus in Orange County or Joyce Dudley in Santa Barbara County. But it's really hard to find an honest district attorney. Even if they start out honest, right. The push to go corrupt is just tremendous. It's unbelievable what happens. So tell me, Mr. Williams, where were you born?
Born in Pineville, Louisiana.
And your father's name was?
Willie Williams.
And your mother's name was?
Barbara Williams.
And how many brothers and sisters do you have?
3 sisters and 2 brothers.
Are any of them wanting to be private attorney generals?
No.
Are they older than you?
All but one.
All but one. So you're the little guy in the family totem pole.
Right.
You got to prove yourself.
Right.
And you did.
Yes.
You went and did something. What caused you to want to do what you're doing?
Well, I got caught in the criminal justice system on a check charge that I shouldn't have been charged with. I fought it for about 2 years, had to hire an attorney. He basically told me to plead guilty. It would be easier, even though I was innocent.
Of course.
And
easier for him.
Right. I was like, well, why should I have to plead guilty for something I didn't do that I know I was innocent of? He said, well, Mr. Williams, the way it works in this county is they have a 100% conviction rate, and they're not going to take it to trial if they know they can't beat you. So you're going to either plead guilty or they're going to make your life miserable.
This was Louisiana.
No, this was Alabama.
Oh, Alabama.
Yeah, this was in Alabama. So so I had to plead guilty. So when I went to go plead guilty, I said, I'm not pleading guilty because I'm guilty. I'm pleading guilty because you're forcing me to plead guilty. And so the judge was like, I cannot accept that. I cannot accept that plea. So I at least wanted to get it on the record. Even at that time, I didn't know the law, but I knew to at least put that on the record. And so once I pled guilty, they gave me 2 years probation, and I made a promise to myself. I said I would never walk in this courtroom again and not be able to defend my own rights. And that's what got me started on this path.
That's what did it. Everybody has something. And that was what year was that?
That was 1989. It was 2001 when I pled guilty, and from 2001 to now is what I've been doing.
Wow. And you've got an actual badge issued by who?
By United States Office of the Private Attorney General. It's a de jure federal agency that myself and some other private attorney generals set up. It's not a de facto governmental agency, it's a de jure.
De jure.
Right. De jure means the lawful and rightful government, and not the de facto, which is the government that the people think is lawful and the one that they presently obey, but that's not lawful.
I understand you, actually. I understand what you're saying. I'm not sure most people do. There's a difference between what's statutorily legal and what's constitutionally lawful. And what Mr. Williams is talking about is the we, the people, constitutional lawful.
Right.
And that's not what we're living in. It indeed is not what we're living in. The de jure government, the one that they killed, I think, around 1871, after they passed the second 13th Amendment. There was one from 1810, and then they passed another one and called it anti-slavery, which has nothing to do with the original first 13th article of the amendments of the Constitution. Yeah, I get what Anthony's saying, and I can see why it ticks off the judges, because they don't want to raise that issue. They don't want you to understand our government has been subverted. And the Banking Act, when the banksters took over under President Wilson over 100 years ago in 1913, that really gave them a lot of power, because then they could just create money out of thin air, whether it was on warfare or welfare, it didn't matter. Just create a huge national debt. I hope he's successful in cutting back at least 50% of the federal jobs. Just eliminate the entire Department of Education. The federal department does nothing to help the state or the county education at all. It just puts in a lot of gobbledygook. We need to get local control of education. With that, I have another little clip I want to go back to. Run it. We're not going to embarrass our ally Israel. I'm not sure Israel was really the root problem. I think some crazy people in the military, pushed by the bank gangsters. You know who the bank gangsters are now. Names like Rothschild, Warburg, Schiff, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Chase, Mellon. All of these people have tremendous control. You have nothing to do except to pick between the puppets they give you. And right now they want to give you a puppet called Barack Obama for 4 more years. Or you can have another choice of a different puppet called Mitt Romney for 4 years. But both of those puppets are dangling on the strings pulled by the bank gangsters. That's what the show is about tonight. Because you won't know how to take back America. You won't understand until you realize how treason has been perpetrated in this United States of America for 100 years. And our school books have stopped talking about the money trust. You know, when I was in college, my freshman year on Bascom Hill, I had to go to this Econ 101. They wanted me to study economics. And I studied, and there's this M1, and there's an M2, and there's M3, and there's a government pumping in. All that was crap. And now I realize it was crap. It took me 30, 40 years to unlearn the garbage they put in my head. There's no such thing as a business cycle that recurs so often. That's all crap. What there is the bank gangsters that extend credit and then they pull it back in and buy back all your failed businesses. And those same bank gangsters are still running the global agenda today. There's whole dynasties of banking families, Chase, Morgan, Rothschild, whole dynasties. And those are our true enemies. Not the Islamic, not the Russians, not the Chinese, the bank gangsters, I call them. Trump is a great threat to the bank gangsters, I believe. If you look at what he did the first full day in office, Trump went to the CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia, and said, I hope you guys are on my side. I hope you're team players. Why did it? No president has ever done that. To me, that says Trump knows the CIA doesn't really work in America's best interest. They put out drugs. They had a drug farm at Langley, which allegedly exploded after it caught fire. Trump was there, and supposedly he landed military troops to arrest CIA agents. We'll go back to Anthony Williams. Pay close attention, people. Bonuses for stealing children. Was that ever an issue in your life where they get into this? Did you ever help any of the moms or dads that had their kids taken?
Well, not in my journey. Yeah, not in my journey. My journey mostly was criminal, criminal justice system, getting guys out, the criminal justice system that was wrongfully incarcerated, wrongfully charged, wrongfully convicted, foreclosure defense, tax relief, fighting against the IRS, because if people don't know, the IRS is not a governmental entity. It's a private corporation, which you don't have to pay them unless you volunteer.
But they get real nasty if you don't volunteer.
Right. If you don't know the law.
If you don't know the law.
Right.
In fact, if you don't believe what he just said, because April 15th is coming up really soon, and I'm going to have to dig up that old footage you haven't used for 10 years. I don't have it tonight. But if you take your 1040 form and look in the bottom left or bottom right corner, there should be a federal ID number, because every federal government form has a federal, and 1040 is not it. That's just a title of the form. There's a little number down in the lower left and right, and the 1040 doesn't have it. At least the last time I filled one out, they didn't have it. So you know that's not an official government form. So why are you paying those people? Because you don't want to go to jail.
Right.
Just as he said, I'm pleading guilty because you're forcing me to. And that's why you're paying the tax, because you know somebody will come knocking on your door and say, come with me.
Right.
You didn't pay your taxes.
Right.
Well, I volunteered 10 cents, I mailed my dime. Isn't that enough? No. And that brings me to my interviews I did with Erwin Schiff out of Las Vegas, Nevada, who's now sitting in a federal prison, I think somewhere in northern Indiana. And he proved to me, he had the IRS code book. He said, look, if you don't pay the liquor tax, there's a penalty. If you don't pay this tax, there's a penalty. And we flipped through it, and he says, now look, federal personal income tax, look for the penalty. And there wasn't any.
Right.
It's not there. So why are you paying? You're paying because you know, or if you've watched my show, Erwin Schiff went to prison. But he didn't go to prison because of that. He went to prison because of a book. I forgot to bring it tonight. It's called The Federal Mafia. You ever seen his book?
I haven't seen that book.
It's called The Federal Mafia. There's no naked women. There's no cleavage. There's no calls to overthrow the government violently. All it does is detail point by point why you can write the U.S. Treasury and say, give me back my last 3 years' income taxes. You took it fraudulently from me by deception. And I did that interview. It's on my YouTube clip with KCAL 42. Or was it KCAL 41? Some second thoughts. I'm William Wagener, your host.
And Brianna Morris, your co-host. See you next week. See you next week.